I spent years thinking my work with Elvis Presley had been just another service, just another updated policy, another signed form, another famous client wanting discretion. But 14 days before he died, Elvis called me personally, his voice low, tense, almost trembling, asking for a change that made no sense at all. He didn't want to increase coverage, didn't want to add someone. He wanted to remove a name from the policy, and when I asked why, he simply said, "If something happens to me, don't let this person get near what's mine." I thought it was paranoia. Now, I know it wasn't. And today, after so many years, I ask myself, would you stay alive after discovering that a simple signature could destroy everything? I remember the exact day the phone rang, and Elvis's voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early August 1977, unseasonably hot even for Memphis, and I was reviewing routine paperwork when my secretary buzzed through with an urgency that made me look up from my desk. "It's Mr. Presley," she said, her voice carrying that mixture of excitement and nervousness that famous clients always inspired. "He's asking to speak with you directly." That alone was unusual. In the 5 years I'd handled Elvis's insurance portfolio, every interaction had been filtered through his business manager or one of his personal assistants. Elvis himself never called. He signed documents, he approved changes, but the actual communication always went through intermediaries. That was how it worked with clients at his level. But this time, he wanted to speak with me directly. No managers, no assistants, just him and me. I picked up the phone, and the first thing that struck me wasn't his voice. It was the silence around it. There was no background noise, no music, no voices, none of the ambient chaos that usually surrounded Elvis. It sounded like he was calling from somewhere isolated, somewhere private, maybe even somewhere he'd gone specifically to make this call without being overheard. "I need to make a change to the life insurance policy," he said, his words coming quickly, almost rushed. "I need you to remove a name from the beneficiary list." I pulled his file from my desk drawer, scanning the current policy documentation. "Of course, Mr. Presley. Can you tell me which beneficiary you'd like to remove?" He gave me the name. I won't repeat it here. I've kept that confidence for nearly 50 years, and I'll keep it until the day I die. But I can tell you this. When he said it, my pen froze halfway to the paper. This wasn't some distant relative or forgotten friend. This was someone close, someone significant, someone whose removal from the policy didn't make any practical or emotional sense, given everything I knew about Elvis's life and relationships. "Mr. Presley," I said carefully, trying to maintain professional composure while my mind raced through implications. "I need to follow standard protocol here. Can you help me understand the reason for this change? It's for our records, and it helps ensure—" "Just do it," he interrupted, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to fear. "Do it before it's too late." The urgency in those words didn't match the situation. We were talking about an insurance policy, a simple administrative change that could be processed in a matter of days. There was no deadline, no emergency, no reason for the desperation I heard in his voice. "I can certainly process this," I said, "but I should ask, would you like to add another beneficiary in this person's place, or adjust the distribution percentages among the remaining—" "No," he said sharply. "Just remove the name. That's all I need." I made a note on the file, my handwriting shakier than usual. "Mr. Presley, is everything all right? You sound—" "Trust is a rare thing around here," he said, and the statement hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. "I'm learning that now. Maybe too late, but I'm learning." I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what had prompted this change, what had happened to damage the relationship with this person he was now removing from his policy. But the tremor in his voice told me to stay quiet, to just process the paperwork and not push for answers he clearly didn't want to give. "I'll get the paperwork started immediately," I assured him. "You'll need to sign the amendment, and we can have a courier bring it to Graceland for your signature, or—" "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "I'll sign it in person." That shocked me. Elvis didn't make house calls to insurance offices. Elvis didn't go anywhere without security, without planning, without his entire world knowing where he was. "That's not necessary, Mr. Presley. We can certainly arrange—" tomorrow," he repeated, and then the line went dead. No goodbye, no thank you, no talk to you soon. Just abrupt silence, as if he'd hung up in the middle of his own sentence or someone had disconnected the call for him. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, and felt something I'd never experienced in 20 years of handling insurance for high-profile clients. Genuine fear. Not fear of liability or legal complications. Fear for him. Fear that whatever had prompted this change, whatever had put that tremor in his voice and that urgency in his words, was something dangerous. Something that went far beyond insurance policies and beneficiary designations. I looked down at my notes. One name crossed out, one person removed from Elvis Presley's life insurance policy 14 days before he died. And even then, some part of me wondered, was he trying to protect his assets, or was he trying to protect himself? Elvis never showed up the next day to sign the paperwork. I waited in my office until well past closing time, the unsigned amendment sitting on my desk like an accusation. When my secretary finally left for the evening, she gave me a concerned look but said nothing. We both knew that when clients like Elvis changed their minds or got distracted, you didn't push, you just waited. But 2 days after that strange phone call, on a Thursday morning, someone else came instead. I was reviewing files when my secretary buzzed through again, her voice uncertain. "There's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's about Mr. Presley's account. He doesn't have an appointment." "Send him in," I said, assuming it was the courier finally arriving with Elvis's signature. The man who entered my office wasn't a courier. He was in his late 30s, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but rumpled, like he'd been wearing it for too long without rest. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the room, checking the windows, glancing back at the door as if making sure no one had followed him. I recognized him vaguely from photographs I'd seen in magazines, one of Elvis's inner circle, though I couldn't recall his specific role. Security, maybe, or personal assistant, someone who'd been around long enough to be trusted with sensitive matters. "I'd need to see the file," he said without preamble, without introducing himself or explaining why he was there instead of Elvis. "The insurance policy, the recent changes." I hesitated. "I'm sorry, but I can only discuss policy details with Mr. Presley himself or his designated legal representative. Do you have authorization?" He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and slid it across my desk. It was a brief letter on Graceland stationery, signed by Elvis, authorizing this man to review all recent amendments to life insurance documentation. The signature looked authentic, though shakier than I remembered from previous documents. "I don't need copies," the man said as I opened the file cabinet. "I don't need details. I just need to confirm that the change was actually registered, that it's official." There was something in his voice, an edge of anxiety, almost desperation. This wasn't a routine verification. This was something that mattered deeply to him, though I couldn't understand why. I pulled the file and showed him the amendment form, the one Elvis had requested but never signed. The man's eyes went immediately to the beneficiary section, scanning the list of names with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When he saw that the removal hadn't been finalized, couldn't be finalized without Elvis's signature, his face went pale. Actually pale, the color draining so quickly I thought he might need to sit down. "Show me the original form," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one Elvis called about." before any changes. I retrieved the earlier version from the file, the policy as it had existed before that strange phone call. The man's hands trembled slightly as he took the document, and he touched one specific field. The name Elvis had wanted removed, with a kind of reverent horror. He stared at it for a long moment, his finger resting on that single entry in the beneficiary list. Then he said something I'll never forget. So he really did it. He had the courage. The way he said courage made it sound like the most dangerous thing in the world. Not a virtue, but a threat. Not bravery, but recklessness. "I'm sorry," I said, leaning forward, "but I don't understand. Can you explain what's happening here? Why is this change so significant?" He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made my blood run cold. Not just fear mixed with guilt, with knowledge of something terrible, with the weight of secrets that were crushing him. "Thank you for your time," he said, standing abruptly and handing the documents back to me. His hands were still shaking. "Wait," I said, standing as well. "At least tell me if Mr. Presley is all right. He sounded troubled on the phone, and now you're here instead of him, and—" "Just keep that amendment ready," the man interrupted, moving toward the door. "Have it ready for his signature. He'll need it." He was gone before I could ask anything else, leaving my office door open and the files scattered across my desk. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the emotional weight behind what should have been a simple administrative matter. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about money. Insurance policies are always about money, protecting assets, providing for loved ones, securing financial futures. But this change, this removal of a name from Elvis's beneficiary list, wasn't financial. It was about keeping someone away, about creating distance, about erecting a barrier between Elvis and a person he no longer trusted, or perhaps feared. The question that began haunting me then, the question I still can't answer, was simple but terrifying. Who did Elvis fear so much that he'd risk everything to remove them from his life? The day after the unexpected visit, I couldn't stop thinking about the man's reaction. The way his face had drained of color, the trembling in his hands, the phrase that kept echoing in my mind. He had the courage. I returned to my office early, before my secretary arrived, and pulled Elvis's file again. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, incomplete, like I was missing a crucial piece of information that would make everything make sense. I started cross-referencing documents, checking dates, verifying signatures, standard due diligence that I should have done immediately but hadn't because of the shock of Elvis's death. And that's when I found it, an inconsistency that shouldn't exist. I was looking through the digital records in our database when I noticed that the beneficiary list didn't match exactly what I had in the physical file. There was a discrepancy, small but significant, in how one entry was formatted, which meant there was another version somewhere, an older version that predated our current system. I went to the archive room, that dusty corner of the office where we kept paper files from before we digitized everything in the mid-70s. Elvis's folder was thick, filled with amendments and updates going back to 1972, when we'd first taken him on as a client. Buried near the bottom, I found a document I didn't remember filing. It was an earlier iteration of the life insurance policy, dated 1975, 2 years before the recent change Elvis had requested. And there it was, the same name Elvis had wanted removed, listed as a beneficiary with a substantial percentage of the payout. But what made my hands freeze was what someone had done to this document. The name had been marked with red pen, not crossed out, but circled heavily multiple times, as if someone had been pressing the pen into the paper with increasing frustration or anger. And beside that circled name, written in careful block letters in the margin, was a note: "Do not allow access without direct authorization." I stared at those words, my heart pounding. This wasn't my handwriting. I would never write something like that on an official document, and even if I had, I'd remember doing it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, deliberate, but not mine. Someone else had accessed this file. Someone else had seen this name and felt strongly enough about it to deface an official document with a warning. But who and when? I started pulling more files, looking for similar notes or markings, trying to find a pattern. That's when I discovered that an entire box of archived documents was missing. The box that should have contained Elvis's correspondence, signed amendments, and related paperwork from 1974 to 1976, the crucial years leading up to his death, was simply gone. Not misfiled, not misplaced. Gone. The archive room had limited access. Only senior brokers had keys, and we kept a log of who entered and when. I checked the log for the past month. My name appeared twice. 2 other brokers had signed in for legitimate file retrievals. But there were 3 entries that consisted only of illegible scribbles, signatures so deliberately messy that you couldn't make out a single letter. Someone had been in here, someone had taken that box, and they'd made sure their identity couldn't be traced. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. This wasn't just about an insurance policy anymore. This was about something being actively hidden, actively removed from the record. I needed answers. I needed to talk to Elvis directly, to ask him what was really going on, to understand why his policy had become the center of what was starting to look like a cover-up. I tried calling Graceland. No answer. I tried again an hour later. Still nothing. I left messages with my secretary's number, asking Elvis or someone from his team to call me back urgently. 3 days passed. 3 days of calling and getting no response. 3 days of checking and rechecking those documents. 3 days of growing dread that something was terribly, terribly wrong. On the 4th day, August 16th, 1977, my phone finally rang. But it wasn't Elvis. It was one of his attorneys calling from Graceland. His voice was hollow, shocked, barely holding together. "I'm calling to inform you," he said, each word seeming to cost him enormous effort, "that Elvis Presley died this afternoon. We'll need you to freeze all policy documentation until the estate can be settled." The room spun. I sat down heavily in my chair, the phone pressed against my ear, unable to speak. "Do you understand?" the attorney asked. "No changes, no releases, nothing until we sort this out." "I understand," I managed to say. The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone, staring at that red-circled name on the old document, and understanding with absolute certainty that Elvis hadn't died of natural causes alone. He died carrying a secret, and that secret was connected to the person he'd tried to remove from his life, just 14 days too late. 3 days after Elvis's death, I received a call requesting my presence at what was described as an official estate meeting. The voice on the phone was polite but firm, explaining that my testimony regarding the insurance policy would be needed to facilitate the settlement process. Something about the phrasing made me uneasy. Testimony suggested legal proceedings, formality, records. But when I arrived at the office address I'd been given, nothing about it felt official. It was a conference room in a nondescript building downtown, not a law office or courthouse. No nameplates on the door, no company logo. Just a room number and a locked door that someone opened from the inside when I knocked. 4 people sat around the table. I recognized the attorney who'd called to inform me of Elvis's death, but the other 3 were strangers. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't offer business cards. They simply gestured for me to sit. "Thank you for coming," the attorney said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. "We need you to review some documentation regarding Mr. Presley's insurance policy. There are questions about the timeline and validity of certain changes." I opened the folder and immediately felt my stomach drop. These weren't documents from my office. These were versions of Elvis's life insurance policy I had never seen before. Amendments with dates I didn't recognize, clauses I would never have approved, language that contradicted standard industry practice. "Where did these come from?" I asked, looking up. "These aren't from my files." "Oh, these are the official versions," one of the strangers said, a woman with steel grey hair and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "We need you to confirm their authenticity." I flipped through the pages, my confusion growing with each one. There were signatures that appeared to be Elvis's, but something about them was wrong. The pressure of the pen was inconsistent. The loops in certain letters didn't match his usual style. I'd seen enough of Elvis's signature over the years to recognize these subtle differences. "I can't confirm authenticity on documents I've never processed," I said carefully. "These didn't come through my office. Where exactly did you obtain them?" The attorney cleared his throat. "We understand that Mr. Presley was under significant stress in his final weeks. We're trying to establish whether he was in a proper state of mind to make legal and financial decisions during that period." I understood immediately what they wanted. They wanted me to say Elvis had been incompetent, mentally unfit, unable to make rational choices. They wanted me to invalidate any changes he'd made, including the removal of that name from the beneficiary list. "Mr. Presley was completely lucid when he called me," I said firmly. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He was specific, deliberate, and—" "But you also noted in your file," the woman interrupted, "that he sounded troubled and urgent. Those were your words. Could that urgency have been a sign of instability, of paranoia, perhaps?" My jaw tightened. They'd read my private notes. They'd gone through my files without authorization. "Being troubled doesn't mean being incompetent," I said. "He had every right to make changes to his own policy." The attorney leaned forward. "We're asking you, in your professional capacity, to consider whether Mr. Presley's state of mind—" "No," I said flatly. "I won't sign any statement declaring him incompetent. He wasn't. And whatever changes he wanted to make, he had every legal right to make them." The room went silent. The woman reached into her briefcase and pulled out another folder, this one with my name on it. "Then I hope you understand what you're doing," she said, her voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "People have lost much more than their jobs for less than this. Careers have been destroyed, reputations ruined, lives made very difficult." She slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The threat was clear. "I understand perfectly," I said, standing up. "But I won't lie about what happened. Elvis wanted to make a change. He had his reasons, and those reasons died with him." I walked out of that room knowing I'd crossed a line, knowing that whatever secret Elvis had been trying to protect, whatever truth he'd wanted to expose by removing that name from his policy, was bigger than I'd imagined. The policy wasn't the problem. The truth behind it was. And someone was willing to threaten, manipulate, and rewrite history to make sure that truth stayed buried. A week after that threatening meeting, I returned to my office to find my file cabinet had been opened. Not broken into, opened with a key, professionally, leaving no trace of forced entry. But I knew immediately because of the way the folders were arranged. I'm meticulous about organization, and these files had been disturbed, examined, and replaced by someone who didn't know my system. The Elvis Presley file was still there, but when I went through it page by page, I discovered that specific documents were missing. Not the entire file, that would have been too obvious, just the paperwork related to the amendment Elvis had requested. The unsigned form where he'd wanted to remove that name, the notes from our phone conversation, the documentation of the change he'd tried to make 14 days before his death. All of it. Gone. I immediately called our security company, but they had no record of any unauthorized access. The building's surveillance footage from that night had mysteriously malfunctioned, a technical glitch that erased 6 hours of recording. Someone with resources, with connections, with power, had taken those documents, and they'd done it in a way that left me with no proof, no evidence, no way to demonstrate what had been there before. But what terrified me most came 2 days later, when I received updated documentation from the estate attorneys. Official, notarized versions of Elvis's life insurance policy. And when I looked at the beneficiary list, I felt my blood turn to ice. The name Elvis had wanted removed, the name he'd called me about in desperation, the name that had driven him to request an immediate change, was back on the policy. Not just back, but listed as the sole primary beneficiary, receiving the largest portion of the payout. Someone had restored what Elvis had tried to erase. Someone had undone his final wish, had overridden his explicit instructions, had rewritten his legacy to benefit the very person he'd wanted to exclude. I tried reaching out to the man who'd visited my office, the member of Elvis's inner circle who'd come to verify the changes. But when I called the number I had for him, it had been disconnected. When I asked around discreetly, trying to find anyone who'd worked with Elvis and might have answers, I hit walls of silence. "I can't talk about that," one person said. "I don't remember," said another, though their eyes told me they remembered perfectly. "You should let it go," a third warned me, "for your own good." I went back through every version of the policy I could find, the original documents, the copies I'd made, the digital records in our system. They were all different now. Dates had shifted, clauses had changed, beneficiary percentages had been adjusted. It was as if someone was systematically rewriting history, creating a new version of events that served their purposes rather than honoring Elvis's wishes. What I'm left with are fragments, pieces of a story that no one wants to explain, documents that contradict each other, and a question that haunts me every day. If something happens to me, don't let this person get near what's mine. That's what Elvis said to me. Those were his exact words, spoken with fear and urgency 14 days before he died. And I failed him. I didn't complete the change in time. I didn't protect what he wanted protected. And now, decades later, I watch as the very thing he tried to prevent has come to pass. I don't know if Elvis was trying to protect me when he shared that secret, or if he was hoping I'd be brave enough to keep fighting for the truth after he was gone. I don't know if his death was simply tragedy or something darker that I'll never be able to prove. What I do know is this: the dark truth Elvis tried to expose is still out there. Someone is still making sure the world never finds out what really happened. And every time I look at that policy, the one that now says something completely different from what Elvis wanted, I'm reminded that some secrets are protected by forces more powerful than truth. The question Elvis asked me that day remains unanswered, and maybe it always will be. Because some people are powerful enough to rewrite history, and some truths are too dangerous to ever be told.